I think what you really want is the wellness coordinator is a very clear way to address what you need is you need someone to own the wellness program. You need someone or some group of people to own what it means to have a culture of health at your organization. Welcome to the Wellable Weekly Podcast, where we talk about key topics and trends at the intersection of well-being, technology, and HR. I'm Nick, along with my good friend and colleague, Geoff. Geoff, nice t-shirt.
Yeah, we've both got the Wellable brand represented today. Halloween edition, though, between the two of us.
Yeah, the black and orange. Yeah, for those of you who are listening and not watching on YouTube, we're both wearing pretty much literally the exact same t-shirt, just different colors. And for what it's worth, I feel like I've never cared too much of like what I'm wearing or fashion until we started doing this podcast so regularly. I'm like, oh, I gotta get a different shirt. And now I think we're at the stage where, like, at least for me, I just don't care. I'm just gonna wear what I normally wear, which is like a disproportionate amount of like Wellable swag.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, so hopping into it, another AI article to kind of kick us off. What's good about this is not necessarily an article, it's actually a study, which I find really interesting. So it's a study from the Stanford University Human-Centered AI group. So I think it's called Stanford HAI, so Stanford HAI, just to kind of set the tone or kind of the foundation. You know, a big part of our audience is involved with the recruitment and retention and things like that. And like an interesting stat was in this kind of opened up in the study, which was 90% of US employers use AI screening tools to sort and rank job seekers, which blew my mind. I know AI is like really popular and everyone's using it. And I always feel like as a company, we are fairly ahead of the times. We do not do that. And so I saw 90%. It's just like completely, was a curveball for me. I didn't understand exactly like how 90% of companies do anything, right? It's a ton of alignment. And I wonder if like that's at scale or if like one group does it. By the way, a huge number of employers are using AI to screen applicants. And what's probably more interesting, kind of if you dive in just a layer deeper, is that the majority of those groups work with the same like few third-party models, right, and vendors. So what you're seeing is a situation where like I, as an applicant, apply to 10 jobs, for example, and I'm applying to more jobs than ever if I'm currently in the job market because it's just so easy to do now relative to before. And I can even spit out customized resumes and cover letters just using AI. So AI has powered the applicant to apply to more jobs than ever, which means just given that dynamic plus the fact that we're in a tight labor market, the sheer number of applicants at each position is, I think, 3x higher than it typically is. So a huge burden on the HR team, the recruitment team, and the various companies are often sorting and ranking them through AI models. So you'll see an AI model being used by, for example, 5 of those 10 companies. And that AI model has now seen that resume 5 different times. And because it sees it 5 different times, it's using some of that older data or some of that initial assessment to render an opinion about that candidate for this new position. Where in the real world, if you didn't have an AI model, you would have 5 HR people review from 5 different companies review this applicant each differently and independently. And the fact that they're not doing it independently anymore, there's some bias and things that kind of come there. So huge study, 3.4 million people who submitted 4 million job applications. It was across 1,700 job postings. So just to give you a sense, 1,700 job postings, and that many submissions to give you a sense of how many job applicants are applying to a finite number of positions. It reflected 150 employers and then 11 industries. So very, very broad. I think it's the first large-scale study of AI hiring, which makes it even extra compelling. And really what it found is that 2 major issues. One, a significant and material increase in racial bias and a tendency by the AI applications to shut out the same people of jobs everywhere they apply. So going back to that example, you apply to 5 jobs because the first one rejected you. And maybe it was like valid. Maybe your skill set didn't match. That rejection will play a factor in the future job applications you apply to that use that same model, and you effectively get shut out at a lot of job applications when you may be good fits for those. So it's bad for the employer because they lose out on a candidate that could be a good fit, and it's bad for the employee in the sense that they're not getting opportunities to interview and go to the next step.
Yeah. So a few interesting stats there, right? Several of which I had to look up. So the numbers you shared, right? The applications across this study, I think it was, what'd you say, like 3 million applications, right?
3.4 million people submitting
Right.
to 4 million job applications, or who submitted 4 million job applications.
Right, right. I mean, if you break down the math, I think that's across those 1,700 job postings. I mean, that's over 2,000 application per job posting, and to me, that just sounds like a really big number, right? And then do some research around that, and it's actually not that uncommon for some of these larger companies who are really appealing for folks coming out of college and looking for secure job at a well-established company, with compelling benefits, pay, things like that. So that number, although it was part of a study, I think is reality, right? And because of that level of interest and the ease with which people can apply now, it's made kind of this perfect storm of an increase in the number of applications, and in order to handle that increased volume, organizations are resorting to tools powered by a select few AI models to review them much more efficiently. But the term that the article kind of coins to describe the effect of how all this is kind of coming together is algorithmic monoculture, right? And so again, another thing to look up and maybe define for the audience. So interestingly, that term monoculture, it actually comes from farming, from agriculture. And the basic premise is that if every farm plants the same single crop strain, then one disease could just wipe everything out because there's no diversity, right? There's no redundancy in the crops. And the same logic applies here. When every employer virtually uses the same AI vendor for screening, then those rejection decisions become correlated. So normally you'd have a situation where, hey, you put in a resume to company A and company B, the odds of acceptance shouldn't be connected, right? They're deciding independently, two different companies, two different roles. But if they're running that same algorithm and that algorithm, for whatever reason, doesn't like your profile, they can reject you for the exact same reason. So it's not just bad luck. You're kind of getting locked out of a market by a single or very few number of systems that, again, most people aren't even cognizant of the fact that some of this stuff could be happening in that void when you're submitting your applications.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one detail about the study, which is probably important, is that all these applications, these industries, these employers, all were using the same AI hiring tool. So there's a small number that these companies, and 90% of companies who are doing this are using. But in this specific study, they looked at one tool. So for sure, every application was kind of going through the same algorithmic hiring model, which is, as you noted, effectively said that being rejected from one position made you more likely to be rejected from every position, right? And the reality is, I always think about the term AGI, so artificial general intelligence, is just a term in the AI industry that's meant to define the idea that an AI can be intelligent the way a human is intelligent, right? And that it can have the same dynamics and thinking and thought process and cognition that a human does. And so in the perfect world, perfect being like an AI optimist world, right? This AI hiring tool can be like a recruiter who goes through each application and then rates them and passes them some off to like the next step, et cetera. But the reality that's happening is that a recruiter sees a application and reviews it independently, in the sense that this recruiter at company A is looking at this resume for the first time. Recruiter B at company B looks at the resume for the first time. Each evaluation of that exact same resume is independent of each other, which is not the case when they all feed into a single model. And so effectively, these AI models carry these properties that maybe they are intelligent enough to be AGI, but by the fact that they're seeing the same application for multiple job postings, they effectively have these properties or characteristics that just can't coexist in the decision-making process that happens from recruitment in the company, trying to hire people, right? So one is like they're pervasively adopted in the sense that a recruiter typically is like not seeing the same applicant, but this model can see the same applicant across multiple, job postings, just because it's spread out that way. It's a computer. There's no time limit, right? They can remember everything from the past, right? It's highly consequential, right? It's opaque to the public. So these are just generally like characteristics that just don't occur, right? There's not opacity in the recruiter in terms of how they're thinking about it from their boss's perspective, right? They've had a conversation, be looking out for these specific characteristics. This black box of a model has all these things that even if it was smart enough to be quote AGI, there's something really fundamentally different from the current process. And I think you could make the argument our current recruiting model does not work and this is better. And you can probably reasonably have that debate, but to think that it's going to replace a human in the same way is just a little bit odd. And I don't know how you solve for that. Like, we talk a lot about like optimizing our Claude instance or our Copilot instance and things like that here at Wellable. And we talk a lot about skills files. Like, do you have skills files that tell the AI agent, don't do this, or always when I'm writing a paragraph, use an extra comma, right? Certain like very hard rules that you want it to follow. Maybe you could do a version of if you see a resume that appears to come up again, but not for this posting, like clear your history, right? Or I don't know, right? I don't know if that works, because I don't know if that is a problem or if it's just like the same model is going to digest it the same way and it's going to get the same output whether it had that history or not.
Right. I think that's the natural instinct when you read an article like this. If you're an HR leader, you see the study. What is your next step? Is it to kind of defend the tool that you've been using and look for tweaks, which is probably the most likely course of action, is like, hey, how can we improve the configuration of the screening tools that we're using to keep those efficiency gains, right? Rather than ditch it altogether. I don't necessarily know, if that's really going to be a course of action for many employers because of the volume and scale of applications that they're receiving every day for new postings. So I think some of the onus is on the AI, the organizations, the screening tool providers who are utilizing these models to allow for company requested configurations and be able to take those in and actually have them impact memory and the way that screenings are conducted. But I'm not sure if there's a real big change that HR will make because of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough place to be in HR, right? And it kind of dovetails into our next story. But even if your HR team remained the same size and now you have 3x the applications, like it's probably not equipped to deal with that flow. So there's got to be a solution there. AI seems like a natural one. Obviously, there's clearly some real challenges that this article or this study kind of identified. But I don't know what the next step is. The answer is like you just power through 3x the number of applications. That doesn't seem like the right solution. You could say hire more people, but our next article suggests like that's not the direction we're going to. So it's about Uber. Uber is planning to lay off 23% of its HR workforce, right? For what it's worth, before we get into the details of like what that means, like Uber has very explicitly said this is not an AI-driven layoff, and like which is very different from almost every other layoff you've seen in the news lately. Everything's been AI-driven. It's a little bit hard to completely believe because I feel like Uber has disproportionately been in the news lately. It was first about its like super strong intention to use AI to optimize their business. Then it came out that they blew through their AI budget in the first 3 quarters or first 3 months of the year. And then the CTO came out, and this is all like within like weeks of each other, came out and talked about how they don't have a very clear or demonstrable ROI from their AI spend. So before you hear about this layoff, what you know is that they are spending like AI crazy and they don't really have something very clear to show from it, which means they're probably looking for some cost savings. And in this new world of AI, it feels like everyone's cutting middle managers. And like, not to say all HR folks are middle managers, but they have a middle manager-esque type of dynamic, right? Of having to manage people effectively that lends themselves to be maybe more on the chopping block than other groups, but cutting a quarter of your HR workforce in the context of exponentially more applications makes it hard. The CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, sorry, I'm going to mess that name up. In an internal memo to all the employees, said, quote, the changes are necessary to maximize the effectiveness of the people team and the enormous potential ahead of us. Very kind of vague. I don't know exactly what that means, but later on they will go out and say this is 100% not AI driven, but I can understand how someone sees that with some degree of like skepticism.
Exactly, right? I mean, it's the actions speak louder than words concept in its like most basic form, right? I just think there's so much kind of scrutiny and skepticism around the intentions of the C-suite and how some of these layoffs have been conducted and the public rationale for those cuts. And I mean, at the end of the day, right, we talked about this with the Bolt CEO, Ryan Breslow, making the announcement of how getting rid of the whole HR team, well, you still have people ops. It's just simply, you have to have these functions covered. You have to have, individuals with true ownership of, kind of blocking and tackling core people related processes to make your business run smoothly, right? And now, if you want to reframe that in different ways, whether it's core human resources versus people operations, that's totally fine. But just cutting the cutting the processes out of your business is certainly not a sustainable process. It's just going to be a matter of how you structure it to make sure those things are still getting done, whether or not it's by the same people or in the same ways.
Yeah, I mean, a similar analogy, I often get the question of like, should a company hire a wellness coordinator, like a dedicated wellness person for their wellness program? And that could be just as an indication of how important building a culture of health is to the company and so forth. And I come back to, sure, maybe. I think what you really want is the wellness coordinator is a very clear way to address what you need. Is you need someone to own the wellness program. You need someone or some group of people to own what it means to have a culture of health at your organization. Now, that could come from a single person whose title is wellness coordinator, but it also could come from a wellness committee. It could come from an HR benefits person who's like really in tune with well-being and wants to own this process. It just doesn't have wellness in their title. What you can't have is launching like a wellness software program without having any true owner internally, because it's just going to flop. It's not going to be successful. You really need someone to own that, similar to the HR stuff. Yes, it could be HR, but the reality is you have all these processes. Someone should own them. Maybe HR, maybe it's the managers. It can be a combination, but you just can't ignore those. And I got to think Uber's a sophisticated company. They're not going to all of a sudden like forget payroll or forget this benefit. They're not that stuff's not going to slip. They're just trying to distribute that to maybe the idea of like kill the middle management groups and distribute that to directly to the rank and file in terms of responsibilities.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, that seems like a good place to wrap up today's podcast. Thanks as always for those who tune in. You can always catch us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to subscribe to Wellable Weekly, our newsletter, for all the latest insights. Thank you.